We all know that there are two sides to every coin, just as there are always two sides to every argument. And as such, there are two sides to every war. Here in the United States, we talk about the Battle of Midway during World War II as the incredible victory or the miracle at Midway. In this book, Shattered Sword, the author tells the story using primary Japanese war literature. You see, after the Battle of Midway, when Japanese battleships went back to Japan with their tail between their legs, they had to write a report for their emperor as to what happened. And the admirals had to sit down and interview the different captains on the various battleships and cruisers, and had to figure out who took off at what time, what planes were in the air, and use those logs to put together the Japanese side of the story. The problem is, after World War II, the United States was censoring the Japanese, and so the Japanese story did not get out right away. And what ended up happening is that once the Japanese were allowed to talk, one of the soldiers who was fighting at the Battle of Midway wanted to get his story out. And since most of the Navy literature from Japan is in Japanese, his translated work became what was used by United States authors when they told the story of the Battle of Midway. The problem is, this Japanese sailor who was the first to get the word out stretched the truth in a lot of different ways. And this book, Shattered Sword, now goes back and re-examines the Battle of Midway using these primary naval documents from Japan, and then also examines the battle through Japanese war doctrine. And that's very important because that first Japanese author who raced out there to tell a story to make it look like he was an expert, but of course he was not to blame, put in many different things blaming the admirals for decisions that they did not make. But many of these decisions were not incorporated in Japanese war doctrine. In fact, they weren't even in United States war doctrine. It took the entire World War II before these new tactics were invented and utilized. What we see is that much of United States' vision of what happened from the Japanese side has been distorted for 50 to 60 years. And meanwhile, back in Japan, they have considered this first sailor's account nothing but hogwash and lies. But that news didn't get back to the United States. And with Shattered Sword, this author wants to tell us the rest of the story. The thing that's important to understand is this author is not taking away the importance of the victory to the United States of America. And he is not saying that our soldiers were less brave or anything like that. Instead, he wants to dispel some of the notions that we have. Many of us think that, when we came in and dive bombed those carriers, that the Japanese were within 5 minutes of letting off a raid of pilots that would have destroyed the fleet. But in this book, Shattered Sword, we learn the truth that the Japanese were a half hour to 45 minutes away from launching their airplanes to attack. The Battle of Midway was a turning point in the war. But as you read this book and as you understand some things from the Japanese perspective, was it a turning point in the war? The author of Shattered Swords comes to the conclusion that the war had already been won before the Battle of Midway, and that the Battle of Midway was just where it became obvious to everyone that Japan was going to lose the Pacific theater. Japan had pushed their limits so far, and while they controlled all these small islands, these islands were not producing resources that made it worthwhile for the Japanese to hold. With every new island that Japan had conquered, it was stretching its men and materials the further out. And they couldn't produce enough war material, whether it was planes, whether it was ships. They couldn't produce enough fast enough to compete with the mighty United States, which had its resources in-house. All the material it needed was in the United States. They didn't need to conquer land in order to take this war directly to Japan. I highly recommend that you read Shattered Sword. If you want to understand the complete picture, not just from the United States perspective, but what was going on back in Japan, then Shattered Sword is a must-read. Until next time, fellow book lovers, I'm Mark Moisier.